right, what's up, everybody? I am here with Aaron Rabinowitz. You may have seen our discussion before, and we are back for round two to discuss metaethics and, of course, moral realism. That's the big topic in metaethics. So let's get into it. But before we do that, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you're up to these days, all that stuff, and then we can get into it.
Yeah, sure. My name is Aaron Rabinowitz. I'm the ethics director at the Creator Accountability Network. I also teach ethics when people will let me. I just finished a PhD in education with a focus in moral education, specifically about the luck stuff that we talked about last time I was on your show, which was fun. But we also had that conversation over on Embrace the Void, one of my podcasts, about moral realism and anti-realism a while back, which I thought was a fun conversation, but was mostly a lot of me poking you about anti-realism. So just wanted to give you the chance to return the favor and all that. But yeah, this is like, I think it'd be fun if we started by talking a little bit about our different experiences in coming to our positions and the way we feel like they have been perceived and treated in our lives. Because I think one of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation is that I stumbled into a rant that you were engaged on Blue Sky, where you were really pissed off at some moral realists for some bad arguments that were essentially, like ad hominem attack level arguments. And so I was excited to, we came to a point of realizing that there was some value in us just clearing out some of those bad arguments before you rip into me on what I consider to be the better arguments for moral realism.
Yeah. So you suggested that we get into, there's a couple things we could get into, which is how we arrived at our positions, and then how those positions have been received either by our sort of colleagues, like the people around us, either in graduate school or in our teaching roles, and then, and how people have interacted with us online. So those are like different things. Which should I start with, or did you want to focus on the latter?
Let's start with the like personal history, and also maybe like a little bit of like the history, because I listened before we chatted to your tier ranking of moral realist arguments that y'all did a little while ago, where in the midst of the ranking of them, you went through a bit of a digression discussion about perceptions of moral realism and why like the attempts to look scientific at various points, that I thought was something that was interesting to me as well in my journey through metaethics, because I think part of what's going on a lot of times in this debate is sort of posturing for the sake of trying to steal valor, or in some way, compare ethics to other things in a way that makes it seem better, or something like that, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you want to start, or should I start?
Well, why don't you go first? Because
Okay.
I think it also would, be cool to hear you sort of an explanation about why you're a bit fed up with moral realists sometimes.
Sure. Okay. So, one of the things that I guess is a little unusual in my case is that I don't recall a time that I ever was a moral realist. Now, that's not to say that I wasn't. It's just to say that I can't recall a time. When I started college, I started a bit early. I started at 16, and I took philosophy. I can't remember at what point I'd have to go look at my transcripts or something to see when I took my first philosophy class. I remember I started with anthropology and astronomy and a few other courses. I don't know when I took it, but as far back as I can remember, when I encountered the anti-realist position, I was like, oh yeah, that's the position for me. This seems to have been a pattern where I would tend to take the position that's often like slighted or on the receiving end of the I don't know, the academic beat stick from other people. So like when I encountered illusionism, I was all in on that. When I encountered utilitarianism, I was all in on that. It's always the view that's on the what looks to me like it's like the bullied target. Even if the view it has, enjoys some level of respect. I just seem to be drawn to those views, but I don't recall or think that I was drawn to them out of some desire to be edgy. I don't take myself to have been, nor do I take myself now to like try to gloat or show off with having an intentionally edgy position to like exploit whatever rhetorical or social benefits there are of being an edgelord and holding some view where people are like, whoa, it's not my vibe.
Right.
I don't think I do that. Maybe I did more of that in the past, but I don't think so. Those were just views I was naturally drawn towards. But I do recall when I encountered like the trolley problem and the footbridge, I didn't have any strong intuitive sense of there being a correct answer. And this generalized to my experience with other philosophical topics. Like I had the same reaction to Gettier problems and others like Mary's Room. And so my approach has always been one of cautious skepticism about the very methods of philosophy itself. Um, it, you know, I see philosophy as potentially serving this role of critiquing whatever the received dogmas are of the society that one finds oneself in. And I think its role in questioning dogmas, I think that's an incredibly important part of philosophy's potential role to maintain a revolutionary spirit in the way in which we think about things at the most fundamental level. And what I found increasingly frustrating as I continued my studies was the growing sense that there was, in a certain sense, an orthodoxy or an attempted orthodoxy, either in metaphilosophy or specific positions within philosophy, um, that seemed not like it was all that receptive to challenges to that orthodoxy. Like it tolerated the challenges, but it was haughty and kind of superior in doing so. And I've encountered that a lot over the years, not just with realists, but for instance, I see people sneer with contempt at Dan Dennett's views about consciousness. I see them sneer with contempt at utilitarian views or towards pragmatism, which is a view I've been drawn to more recently. There just seems to be this vibe that I've seen in quite a lot of people to be unreceptive to certain sorts of views and to be smug and authoritative and kind of smarmy and obnoxious about it. And this is especially true of certain sorts of views that have been relegated, or there's been an attempt to relegate them fully to the dustbin of history. Logical positivism, ordinary language philosophy. Liam Coffey Bright, there's Abner Boz. There are people that are continuing to carry the torch for these views, and I love their work. I think their work is brilliant and fascinating and cool. And I don't like when people try to beat down on these views. I think these views have a place in philosophy, even if they're wrong. They have a place in philosophy. So I guess something in me might be drawn not towards being edgy, but towards, I don't know, defending the philosophical underdog. But I don't know how much of a bias that is, or how much that's sort of an afterthought. I've said a lot though, so I'll pause there to see what you have to say about all that.
No, I love that narrative because it's hilarious to me because I have a similar experience, and yet we are on opposite sides of this particular topic. And also my experience is that the underdog is the opposite of your experience of the underdog in this particular situation. So like to share a little bit of my background just for comparison's sake, I came to philosophy, I guess, relatively late. I mean, everyone seems to come to philosophy in undergrad, right? But like I started out going to undergrad in theater and then got interested in philosophy when I was there and realized that it was something that people who were still alive or doing. And like I happened to be at UVA, which is was at the time a more sympathetic to moral realism department because it had several virtue ethicists in it. And I think we can talk about the history of realism and anti-realism, as like cultural positions. But I think one thing we can say is that if there has been a resurgence of people being pro-moral realism, it's often been on the backs of a resurgence and interest in virtue ethics. So I was introduced to a lot of virtue ethicist attempts to defend moral realism against the anti-realist attacks of the early modern period, of the like philosophers who wanted to say, look, every moral judgment can be atomized down into your statement of fact and your, attribution of preference, or however they wanted to like qualify the evaluative aspect of it. And then they would say, look, the statement of fact can obviously be looked at, quantitatively assessed, debated, etc. The evaluative judgment is, just a preference, right? They often were reducing it down to, this is just what you like or whatever, and therefore isn't real, and doesn't need to be sort of studied or debated. in the most extreme forms, right? Like I had a very, like a strong, like I don't feel like I had a strong intuition in favor of moral realism immediately, so much as I had a very strong allergic reaction to like Ayers and Mackey and their arguments against moral realism. It did seem to me that moral realism is weird. Like, I think people who pretend that moral realism is the most intuitive position in the modern world for secular individuals are like lying to themselves. Like, it's a weird position. You have to explain how it fits into materialism. It may not be weirder than quantum physics, but it's still unusual and weird. And that was sort of what I was taught initially, is that like this is a view that people at our university kind of favor. You're going to find a lot of hostility about this, broadly speaking, though, because most, especially high tier universities, are still in the anti-realist camp pretty heavily. When I was applying for graduate school the first time around, I think someone at Michigan made a joke about like, if do y'all study moral realism? We don't actually know what that is, so we don't really study it. And then when I went to Colorado State for master's, I also had someone, Elizabeth Trotman, who was a out and out sort of intuitionist moral realist. I read things like Rush Schaefer Landau's Moral Realism, A Defense. And I was pretty sort of thoroughly convinced of the view. Like, it seemed like the correct way to describe the thing. You just have to work through a lot of weirdness that seems to go along with that description. But it was always my impression that was a minority position, generally speaking, and one that would kind of get you laughed at in philosophy circles. And also, when I started to move into like doing activism in atheist spaces, gets you laughed at in those circles too, because to them, moral realism is an artifact of a religious worldview, and like, how are you going to explain all of that weirdness on their atheist kind of worldview? So pretty much everywhere I've gone, it's been a view that I think people were less likely to be sympathetic to, which at least means that, when we get to the point where you want to criticize it, you can go as hard as you want, and it's not going to hurt me at all, because I've heard everything and feel nothing. But I think, to one point, maybe we can start talking about bad arguments connected to this kind of disrespectful approach, is the kind of X is immoral because, they believe a particular meta-ethical view, right? I think those arguments are pretty terrible. And I see them going in both directions. So, for example, I, as a moral realist, have often been accused of, being too likely to Bigfoot around and exert my realist preferences on people, because in a lot of people's views, realists, again, are the kind of dogmatists who, start crusades. So
yeah, I actually have a paper with my colleagues, Andres Montalegre and David Moss, where we did some empirical research on how people perceive expressions of people reporting taking an objectivist or realist stance, and people taking a relativist or anti-realist stance. And people do tend to derogate people that express objectivism, is how we characterize it in the paper, but really moral realism. They don't like them as much as they like people that express a relativist view. That's can be qualified depending on the type of moral issue and the stance of the participant. And so we look at those complications. Like, if the participant is a realist about the moral issue in question, and the person they're judging is a realist, and it's like a really, something really horrific that they're a realist about, people may not take as much of an issue. But, people just throwing around a realist or objectivist stance, yeah, people will perceive those people as rigid dogmatists. I know Goodwin and Darley have some earlier studies where they have some people perceive them that way too. So this
Have you
isn't
all
just
assessed whether
like
it's a matter of arrogance? Have we talked about this before? Is it an arrogance thing?
I know Thomas Polsler has some data on that. I haven't looked at it very carefully, so I don't know the specifics. So we didn't look specifically at arrogance, if I recall. It's been a while since I looked at my own data.
Arrogance. So yeah, my first guess would be perceived hubris or something like that. That like it's a kind of reaction to who do you think you are, that you get to tell people how things are, essentially, right? And I think it comes off in a variety of negative ways. It comes off as being non-collaborative, right? Like, I have the moral truth, whereas anti-realists can be like, look, the moral truth is a discussion. We're all going to have it together, right? We're going to get together and we're going to figure it out. So, I think there are a couple of arguments that I think are very bad for anti-realism. Like, anti-realists make these arguments, but I think they're not good arguments at all. And so I want to like lay those out and apologize for them, so that if at any point I start to slide in those directions, you can call me on that. So like the first one is anti-realists are immoral, right? If you're not a moral realist, you're more likely to, bail on your moral obligations when they conflict with your desires or preferences, right? I think that's sort of most sophisticated way you could put it in terms of a mechanism for explaining. And here's, my response to that essentially is people can be immoral either for anti-realist reasons or for realist reasons, essentially. I think both systems can create permission structures for individuals to act immorally. I also think that both systems probably do impact in various ways how an individual understands their moral obligations and acts on those moral obligations, but I don't think it's like consistently one way or the other enough that we could really say realists are more likely to be ethical or anti-realists are more likely to be unethical. And when this came up on Blue Sky, I compared it to like the immoral non-believer stereotype that atheists are perceived as being less moral by believers, which is a pretty reliable psychological result. I think there's actually a connection there, because I think anti-realism arises in the modern period as a kind of skeptical secular approach to ethics. It's trying to do ethics in a scientifically or empirically, or rationalistly rigorous kind of way. And while I don't agree with where that direction goes at the time, I think they're both connected to a rejection of the previous period where, I agree with you. People don't like have well thought out positions about meta ethics, but I think we could argue that like prior to the 18 or 1900s, the majority, like culture leaned towards a kind of realist way of framing your obligations, usually to God, even if God itself is not actually a source of objective morality. I think that was a pretty widespread perception. And then it like butted up against the, also very common perception that like morality is whatever, I can get away with, or whatever's, like society is trying to foist on people at any given time. I think all of those views have existed since the ancient times. I just think you see a modernist movement to try to move away from what was perceived as moral realism that was stuck in a religious dogmatic kind of framework.
Yeah, we might differ a little bit on that. So, some people seem to agree with me with at the very least that they'll say things like, people without training in philosophy. I use the term non-philosophers. I don't like the XY term, the folk. I don't like that term. This makes it seem like non-philosophers are peasants and like we're nobles sitting in a castle. I don't like that.
We're all just folks here.
Yeah. So some people say, yeah, people don't have well thought out ideas, but I make a stronger claim than that. I think that modern conceptions of realism and anti-realism are, when we try to impose those on people in the past, it's a kind of anachronism. It'd be a bit like trying to impose like modern art movements or styles on ancient art because it kind of resembles a modern style. Those people weren't conceiving of art in terms of the contemporary cultural movements that spawned contemporary art movements. Those are entirely historically contingent recent developments. And I think very much the same thing for secular conceptions of realism. I think that they are a kind of appendix to and development on certain ideas in Western philosophy that are very much removed from the way that ordinary people historically have been disposed to think, speak, and act. And so I don't think that people in the 1800s or prior were, at least most people, were any kind of moral realist. But when I say that, a lot of people presume that I'm saying, therefore, they were some type of anti-realist. Like if they weren't realists, then they must think morality is like radically contingent on cultural consensus or personal whims or something. I don't think that either. I think that a lot of everyday moral judgment just sort of floats free from meta-ethical considerations. And you had said that you think our meta-ethical views, influence us in some ways. To the extent that people have those views, I think it's possible that they do. I could, speaking for myself, the longer I've sort of I want to say like fermented or sat in anti-realism as an idea, the less interested I've become in normative ethics, to the point where I've just sort of stopped doing normative ethics or thinking about it.
Hmm.
Was that influenced by being an anti-realist? Maybe. But I don't think ordinary people, non-philosophers, think much about normative ethics in the first place. So I would make a stronger claim. I don't think people in the past were any type of realist. I think that they were neither realist nor anti-realist, and that just wasn't really a part of the way that they think. So I don't know. I guess I'm focusing a lot on that one little part of what you said, but to me, that's important.
Yeah, I guess I think it's maybe more complicated than that. So, first of all, I would argue, I would at least wonder what your impression would be about, for example, Plato's Republic, right? You have this debate between Socrates and Glaucon and Thrasymachus about the source of normativity, deeply tied to the virtue ethics ideas about why one should be good even when there's no personal benefit to doing so. I consider that a pretty valuable and like pretty formative meta ethical debate about moral realism. That is why when you have virtue ethics coming back into the fore in the 70s and such, that like what it brings with it is a more robust realist perspective about morality. I think one way to understand virtue ethics, and I was thinking about this as we were chatting, like it's part of the goal of virtue ethics is to habituate you to act correctly. That's the ultimate goal, is to habituate you to act well consistently, right? To act according to flourishing by having virtues, which includes, I think, the kind of like perspectives that I associate with moral realism. So essentially, part of virtue ethics is habituating you into what I think of as moral realism, um, which in this context, I think, means partly seeing that there are better and worse preferences or desires that one could act on. Which I'm curious to. Well, I'm curious to see if that is a position that you feel like your view also sustains. But like, setting aside the Greeks, right? The 1400 years in between those two things, I think I agree that for the most part, people don't have well thought out perspectives one way or the other on most philosophical questions, and that when pressed to do so, they will rationalize something and tell you that was their perspective all along, when that is not a reliable report or anything like that. I think, though, that also people had mixes of the kind of psychological impacts of realism and anti-realism that we talk about, where sometimes it was used as a permission structure to prop up dogmatism, and sometimes they were used as permission structures to be iconoclastic and like tear down dogmatism. So I think they did have impacts, even if people weren't always using that language. But I do think, like, associated with this, one of the terrible arguments for moral realism is that it is the most common view. I think that was one that y'all threw out there at some point. Like, I don't think that's any at all plausible that like any metaphysical or complex philosophical position is the most common view, because, as you point out, it implies anyone has thought about these things very much.
Yeah, although philosophers will have subtler arguments for attributing realism to non-philosophers. They don't necessarily say that they believe realism is true, or if you presented it to them, they would say,
Sure.
"Yeah, that's what I believed all along." They may say something like uh, the best account of their linguistic outputs in a way that makes no distinctive claim to psychological reality, some kind of like Chomskyan kind of thing,
Right.
is one which construes ordinary moral discourse in realist terms. So they might say, well, the English language appears to be one in which its speakers they're competent speakers, and they appear to be speaking in a way that would commit them to realism in some non-conscious way. So they may say something like that. I don't buy that either. I have issues with the presumptions about the way language works, and some other
Sure.
considerations behind that. So they could try to circumvent some of the psychological claims. Some of them would say that they're not even making psychological claims. It is. I'll flag that as a question. I just wanted to address the stuff about the Greeks. So 2 points about that. One would be that I'm not sure how anachronistic it would be to project contemporary conceptions, like a kind of post-Morean view of non-naturalist realism versus naturalist realism, onto the way the Greeks think about things. Like they have this like teleological framework, and they have a variety of different perspectives that, from what I've seen, which isn't that much, but it's a bit, they don't map that neatly onto some of the contemporary discourse, and full engagement and comprehension of them requires a kind of inversion of thinking, to think in a somewhat different way. And so I do wonder whether the ancient Greek philosophical perspective on moral realism, to the extent that it existed, was in certain sorts of ways qualitatively quite distinct from the kind of realism that someone like Mike Humer or Schaefer Landau or David Enoch would endorse. I'm still willing to grant, though, that for this, if nothing else, for the sake of argument, let's say Plato was a moral realist or Aristotle was a moral realist. Uh,
Sure.
I'm not sure how much their particular perspectives penetrated ordinary thought. Maybe this isn't something that you would dispute, but I don't think the typical person living in ancient Greece or the ancient world more generally was up and up on the philosophical views of Aristotle and Plato. I mean, these are views that were preserved and cloistered and largely available to the people writing certain sorts of work. So, like
Right.
prominent church figures and stuff like that. I don't think those views received a whole lot of like uptake in the societies in which they existed. I struggle to imagine a smooth conversation with like early English settlers in the United States trying to talk to them about moral realism or anti-realism. The terminology and the ways of framing things, I think, would be quite alien to them. And I do think you could convey the ideas. I don't think they'd be like, this is conceptually impossible. But I think it would become evident if you had a long enough conversation that the kinds of disputes that are animating the contemporary discourse just weren't a feature of the way that they were thinking about morality at the time.
So I would agree in terms of like, again, people consciously having these particular thoughts. If I wanted to make the case, and I don't want to, bog us down too much on the like
Yeah.
psychology of people who neither of us have gotten to research because they're long dead. The argument I would run would be Aristotelian realism gets into modern culture via Christianity, or gets into culture via Christianity, that it heavily impacts the way that Augustine and these folks conceive of God and try to make sense of God's divine will in relation to moral realism. I would argue, they're trying to figure out how to have both in a sense, I think. And what you get are some really, complicated conversations about the nature of a monotheistic divine will, problem of evil, etc. And I think how they conceive of God then impacts how people in our heavily Christianized world perceive of these things as well. But to like generalize the arguments a little bit, when we are talking about moral realism, right? We want to get into the concept of real, but I think broadly speaking, what we are arguing about are things like, what is the grounding of moral truth, if there is such a thing? Do we have access to that moral truth? And if so, how? Those are the kind of main questions that are associated with this. And I would say that people's perspectives on them, you could say, look, if your perspective is we tend to have that there is a grounding of truth for morality external to our preferences in some way, and that we have access to it, that puts you in a fairly realist quadrant. And I think for a lot of history, a lot of people would have just said the grounding of moral truth is God, and we have access to it through the scriptures, and that's the conversation. I could be wrong about that. That could be a misperception about things, but like that would be my if I had to put down money on what most people are going to say about the nature of morality, that's about as much as they're going to say about it.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor this particular issue too much. I feel like this could be a whole digression that we could spend an hour on. What I think is that those views were largely confined to the people that happen to be writing these books.
Could be.
That these aren't views that permeated the culture in which they were in. A more general point I would make about that is like, I've had friends that are religious or have spent a lot of time studying religions, and they've told me a whole lot about like what Catholicism really commits one to, or what this or that sect of Protestantism, denomination, I guess I should say, like what the details of it are. Like I was raised Methodist. I have no idea about the specifics of Methodism. I couldn't tell you. If you showed me, like, I wouldn't even recognize the distinctive features of Methodism if you presented them to me. It's not even like I can't recall them offhand. Uh, I think the vast majority of people that are religious know very little about the formal philosophical and theological underpinnings of their religion. They know a lot of
Mhm.
stuff at the superficial extremity of the religion that is good enough for practical purposes, but not so much the details. I mean, if you want to see a very clear example of this, just watch Danny from Phil Talk. He goes on TikTok and talks to people all the time. A lot of time he talks to Christians. Just get Christians
Mhm.
on there talking about the Trinity, and or get them talking about transubstantiation. He focuses a lot on the Trinity, and it's rare for Christians to really appear to exhibit any deep understanding of what the Trinity is all about, um, like and really give a
This is
theologically
weird.
non blasphemous defense of what the deal is. And keep in mind, those are the people that have self selected themselves into publicly debating the matter. If I went and surveyed like
Sure.
random people in this at a church, my guess is they would know virtually nothing about the specifics of the Trinity or transubstantiation or anything like that. So yeah, I think these views have been largely confined to a kind of rather small intellectual elite that was even smaller in the past, and that whose ideas were far less likely to disseminate among the public than they are now for completely obvious reasons. I mean, people weren't even
Right.
literate, much less had access to the internet.
Right. Entirely possible that like survival was such a priority that for most people this was never going to be a point of concern for them. And just to note it, given that I don't think that anti-realists are by nature immoral, it also just trivially follows that I think a noble lie approach would be a terrible argument.
Mhm.
We're not, like I'm not here to say that we need to make everybody a moral realist because they'll be better, right? Or because that is like I think that is part of what you're doing when you're doing virtue ethics, but I think you could do a kind of anti-realist virtue ethics and you'd probably be fine. Like it's not the important thing that you're habituating there. So I guess should I share like my argument for moral realism? I've sort of knocked out the ones that I don't want to be associated with.
Yeah, I
And
guess
then you can poke
it
holes.
might make sense for me to briefly mention what I take to be some bad arguments anti-realists use, since you've presented some of the bad ones realists use.
Sure. I think the argument from queerness is bad, and I think it's bad in the sense that the world is really queer, and so it doesn't really prove much of anything to say this is super weird. Maybe that's just growing up in a post quantum physics world. Like weirdness is not an objection in my mind. You can feel free to press that one more if you like, though. The argument from disagreement. Um, both Mackey's arguments I think are bad, and the argument from convergence also bad. Like both sides of that are not good arguments. Y'all talked about that one as well. Um, let's see what else. I can't think of any other ones immediately off the top of my head that I think are terrible. Those just particularly come to mind as like what radicalized me.
Yeah, so the first two of those were exactly the ones I was going to point to as what I never took to be particularly good arguments. I mean, arguments from disagreement in their crudest form are just ridiculous. I mean, some of like the crudest version is just, hey, lots of people disagree about first order normative issues, therefore anti-realism. And the obvious rejoinder to this is people disagree about all kinds of stuff. That's not a good reason to think that there's not a stance independent fact of the matter. So the more sophisticated versions of this have to push in to these like epistemic concerns. Like, well, what about disputes between epistemic peers and the lack of any sort of available method to resolve those disagreements? Okay, well, if that's your argument, make that argument. Then just say there's no method for resolving moral disagreements, so we're stuck with moral skepticism. We don't have epistemic access to moral facts. But then that's just going to turn right to more fundamental questions about moral epistemology. Then you should have gone for those all along. You didn't. Like, if disagreement is at best this like third or fourth order derivative. It's like a symptom of a symptom of a symptom of some other underlying philosophical disagreement. Just go for the juggler and talk about the more fundamental issue. So disagreement
Mhm.
it's always struck me in its crude forms as awful and obviously wrong, and in its more sophisticated forms, maybe it can do some work, but only kind of indirectly, and really only via its impact on our disputes about moral epistemology. It's the same thing with the Mackey's arguments. Um, when I look at Mackey's arguments, I mean, for one, it looks like there's like multiple arguments that he's presenting. They're not. It's not super clear what exactly those arguments are, how many there are, how they come apart, or what exactly they are. It's not like he lays them out in any formal syllogistic form that's very super clear. To be fair to Mackey, I do think that he was grasping at concerns that a person that's more naturalistically inclined. I mean, I guess one thing to say is they look largely like they're only targeting non-naturalist realism. So I don't even think that they're going to target, naturalist accounts of realism anyway. So they're limited in scope. That's one objection I don't see people point out a lot. They're not very clear or well formulated. But what I see him doing there is trying to grasp at. It's almost like seeing someone reflect on and come up with these ideas for the first time. I do think if more recent work could develop on those arguments a lot better than their initial formulation. So I do think it's a little odd to focus on Mackey. For instance, I think Richard Joyce has done a lot of work to develop error theory much more extensively and clearly than early Mackey stuff, which isn't to knock Mackey at all. But it'd be a bit like, I would, if I was going to critique like a Kantian view, I wouldn't just focus on Kant. Like you're going to have to grapple with the secondary literature from people that have written a hell of a lot more clearly than Kant, and in some cases have deviated, modified, or added things to Kant that improve it. Because the original Kant stuff, I'm not even going to bother to try to interpret what the hell he's saying. It's a pain in the neck. So not that I think Mackey is as unclear as Kant, but I see those as like these inchoate, barely arguments in Mackey. I mean, there's arguments there, but it's muddled. So yeah, I never found those very compelling. But to the extent that you could get something out of those arguments and formulate them in some reasonable terms, I just don't care that much about whether the stance like non-naturalist moral facts would be weird or strange or out of accord with a naturalistic framework. I mean, among other things, I don't care about naturalism. Like I'm not drawn towards naturalism. I'm entirely comfortable with there being facts that wouldn't fit into a naturalistic framework, provided that they do work in a pragmatic framework. So I don't really care about the whole naturalism thing, and I don't think those arguments are good either. So the Mackey's arguments and disagreement I don't really care for. Convergence I think is just not dispositive one way or another. So it's not very strong evidence for realism. It's not very strong evidence against realism. It's like this weak, like you could add 1 point to your scorecard, but if it's basketball, 1 point's not going to make a big difference. So I view none of those as particularly diagnostic. But this points to a more general concern that I have, which is that I just don't really think that there's very good arguments on either side. And I think it's a weird situation. It's kind of like if we've got a battle where everyone's firing blanks at each other, who's going to win?
Yeah, which is sometimes used itself as an argument for anti-realism. Like if this was real, the arguments would be hitting harder. Which I don't think is actually necessarily correct. And I'll point to like the lack of coherence in other fields that are, I think everyone agrees with, dealing with real things, where there's just not a clear way to determine who's right at the moment, and maybe ever. So like, I also just want to say, I agree with you that there are more sophisticated anti-realist arguments. When you asked for weak ones, what came to mind were the ones that pissed me off originally, which are the Mackey ones that are, I would argue, still like, insofar as any of this is culturally influential, I do see those arguments thrown out pretty frequently. I think it's because they are often referenced in like simplified source material and stuff. So when someone is going to look up arguments, they're not going to go read the SCP, page on anti-realism and Joyce's extensive. They're going to find a page that's like, one of the early people was Mackey, who said that this, this stuff is weird. And that's going to be where they're going to probably get some of that source material, I think. So that's why I feel like that gets thrown around in the kind of casual way that the other kinds of arguments for realism get thrown around that aren't very good. You also brought up there the concept of natural, and maybe we want to address that here and now before I sort of defend my position, because one of my big issues with this debate is I don't know what the word natural means, and until we like, when we say, is moral realism true, right? We have to answer, what do we mean by moral realism, and like, what do you mean by true to some extent? And usually that gets into a debate about things like, are these facts natural or not natural? Where I don't think we have often a clear definition of what is natural.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have problems with the concept of naturalism and physicalism, which upsets some of my atheist friends who see like any rejection of or even hesitancy about naturalism or physicalism as some sort of like I'm diving right into the woo stuff and I got to put on my tinfoil hat and start reading horoscopes. And no, I'm an empiricist through and through. I'm just not sold on physicalism and naturalism. So I don't think we're going to have a lot of disagreement on that front. So yeah, why don't you get into the big question? Why are you a realist?
So, I mean, I like insofar as I can trace my belief in this to anything, I read Schaefer Landau's account of stance independent moral realism, and it seemed correct to me. So when we ask, what do we mean by real here? You've been on my show, so you know that I like to actively deconstruct the concept of real because I don't think that we have a unified account of real that we apply to all of our discussions. That real can mean different things for the same person at different times and different things for different people a lot of the time. Sometimes it's a proxy for this thing is really important to me. Often it just means this thing is not under my control in some way, I think. But how Schaefer Landau cashes this out is what he calls stance independent moral realism. So there are moral truths that we can know, and that's a separate claim, but there are moral truths that are independent of any individual's beliefs about them. And that seems correct to me. And the examples that I point to are what I think of as, and this is where I feel like I'm the like really cliche outsider that everyone's going to make fun of. Like I'm just kind of a foundationalist, like a pluralist foundationalist about morality. I think there are for all of like for the main moral positions, the main moral theories like utilitarianism and deontology, there is a fundamental intuition there. I'm an intuitionist as well, so I'll just add that on my list of shames. Like there are fundamental intuitions like, all things being equal, one ought to reduce suffering. All things being equal, one ought to promote flourishing. All things being equal, one ought to respect autonomy. And these moral foundations are true, independent of anyone's beliefs about them, independent of any context, but they come into tension in a variety of ways in our actual lived experiences. And so normative and applied ethics is the process, especially applied ethics is the process of balancing those different normative intuitions to get good outcomes. And there can be debate, I think reasonable debate about what the right outcome should be when those things are in conflict. So I'm a pluralist in the sense that I think that people can disagree about the right way to balance two competing moral demands and both be right up to a point, right? There's a sort of range of acceptable compromises that I think you can take, and then beyond those, you're overly sacrificing autonomy for the sake of some other value in a way that is ethically unacceptable. So that's just kind of like how I perceive morality and understand it, and then think that like most of what we're doing in morality is becoming aware of those different values, habituating ourselves to care more about them, and think more in more complex ways about how to balance them in our lives.
Okay. Now, as far as arguments, were there specific arguments that Schaefer Landau has presented or that other people have presented that you found compelling?
So like the thought experiment that is most compelling to me, and again, this is a it may not apply to your anti-realism kind of argument, but the one that was compelling for me is the thought experiment about imagining a scenario in which all beings who have opinions or preferences or anything all agree that something horrifying is moral. When I would teach, I would use the like torturing puppies example. People complain that that's too emotive, so use something very basic, right? Just like, I don't know, you pick the thing that like is immoral, right? Play the game at home. But my view is So the hypothetical goes, if everyone agrees that it's actually moral, then on the anti-realist view, it is moral. And that is true for some subset of anti-realist views. I have, to be fair, literally put this question to quite a few anti-realists, and quite a few of them have bit that bullet and said, yes, if everybody agreed about this thing, then yes, it would in fact be moral in that context. So I'm not here to strawbot people. These are real beliefs that real academics have told me they really had. You can say that they don't actually have them, but they said they have them. Okay. I think that's a reductio ad absurdum, right? So like I think that shows that something has gone wrong if that is your perception. And to unpack the reductio a little more, what I think they're missing is they've mislocated the source of normativity, the source of moral truth. They've located it in, the preferences of individuals, the subjective preferences, or the agreement between individuals who have preferences. Wherever they're locating it, it's not where I think it should be located, which is in the features of the act itself that determine whether or not it is moral or immoral. So again, people can hate that argument or disagree with it. That was the one that was compelling to me, that had sort of led me to sort of consistently hold this position.
Yeah, so maybe you're not going to like this, but I got to be honest, that's actually on my list of what I would consider to be bad arguments against anti-realism. In fact, I've covered that particular question fairly extensively more recently on my blog and in some of my more recent YouTube videos. I encountered someone who was insisting that a good way to empirically test, because I do psychology of metaethics, so I study how
Right.
non-philosophers think about these questions. They
Mhm.
thought a good idea would be to ask people, hey, if there was a world in which everybody approved of torturing babies for fun, would it be morally permissible for them to torture babies for fun, or would it be morally good for them to do so? And I don't think that this is a good question. And part of the reason I don't think that this is a good question is because there is an ambiguity in what's being asked.
Mhm.
So for me, there's
As
an
in
important
most
distinction.
hypothetical.
Yeah. Well, I think there's, I take this very Wittgensteinian view where I think that ambiguity, lack of clarity, and self-dupery by language is the one of the hallmarks of contemporary analytic philosophy. I think it's everywhere, and I do think that this thought experiment is an example of that. I could tell you why. You may or may not be convinced.
Please
I
feel free to
can say,
go ahead and get our asses. Please feel free. I
well,
get
I can
like
say that
philosophy is about philosophers for sure.
I can say I have a very long article where I get into this in detail, and it includes a link to a video where someone else that makes a similar point does so very concisely in just 7 minutes. Somebody named Travis. He's frequently here in the chat. So Travis, if you're here, um, I'm happy to plug your
Mhm.
video, which is a lot more concise. I posted in the chat. I could send it to you after as well. It's
Mhm.
hard, when you have a philosophical argument that takes some build up to get to. It's
Sure.
hard to express it in real time in a live stream. So if it's worth your while, you could check that out and see what you make of it. But I'll try to get at some of the concerns that I have with that sort of question. Um, the first one is that from my own perspective, when I judge whether something is right or wrong, I judge it relative to my actual standards, like this lance, not some lance in some counterfactual or hypothetical universe. And so, if you
Sure.
present me some hypothetical universe, some other world, and then you tell me the people in that world are, and I'm not thrown off by the emotive examples, so we could go with baby torture, puppy torture, whatever. I don't care. I'm so used to these.
Right.
So if you tell me that there is a world in which the people in that world are all okay with baby torture or genocide or peeling everyone's skin off while they're alive and making lampshades out of it, like just the most horrific shit you could come up with. Uh, and you ask me, well, if they're all okay with it, would it make it okay? There's a problem with that follow-up question. Like, would it be good or would it be permissible or would it be okay? Are you asking me whether it would be good or permissible in some reified sense? Like, I think that if a group of people think something is good, that like makes it good. Like, people talk about desires generating facts, and to me that's a weird metaphor. I don't know how a desire would generate a fact. Like, it's literally like creating facts. There's a lot of metaphysical uh, you know stuff going on with that sort of remark. Like, is that meant literally? Because I don't think that. I don't endorse a metaphysical view like that. If that's meant metaphorically, what is it a metaphor for? What exactly are they supposing is going on? But in any case, so you have this group of people. They all think genocide or baby torture, whatever, is okay. Well, and then you're asking me, okay, so they think it's okay. Does that make it okay? What are you asking me? Does it make it okay in some sense independent of my preferences or values, or dependent on my preferences or values? So if you're asking
Sure.
the former question, obviously no, because I don't think that there stands independent moral facts. If you're asking the second question, does it make it okay? I guess still no, because I don't really care what other people's values are. The fact that someone else thinks something is morally right or wrong has no bearing on whether I think it's right or wrong, because I judge relative to my standards. So if there was a universe in which everybody in that universe is okay with baby torture, and you ask me, do I think it's bad for, baby torture is bad? Yes, I still think it's bad. I think it's bad for them to do it. I think it's bad for anybody to torture babies. All else being equal, why would I be okay with baby torture just because the people doing it are okay with it? So I just don't take it to be an entailment of anti-realism that if a group of people think baby torture is okay, then baby torture is okay. You can judge things according to your own standards. So the
Yeah.
question just strikes me
Let
as very
me
weird.
let me try unpacking a little bit and see if it changes your perspective at all, and if it doesn't, that's fine. Um how I understand this hypothetical, because I think sometimes it comes off as a like, I'm gonna try to talk the anti-realist into being pro baby torture, which is like a not what
Mhm.
a subtle slide back into anti-realist or immoral kind of argument, which is not what I'm going for here. I think the point of this hypothetical is to test the concept of a stance independent moral truth. Like, what would the universe look like if stance independent moral truths exist? Like what would be true about that universe, essentially, right? And so we ask ourselves, in that universe, if everything in that universe that has a preference or is part of the moral judgments or the considerations or whatever, if they all are pro this thing, is there some fact of the matter in that universe that they are getting wrong, that they are wrong about?
Yeah, that's a better way of asking the question. I would just say no, but it's just straightforwardly asking me, are there stance independent moral facts? It's just no. I
Right.
don't have
And that
intuitions like that.
Right, and there again, like I still believe it's a reductio, but I'm glad that it at least clarifies the ambiguity, because to me there is like a fact of the matter in that hypothetical, in that universe, that they are all failing to grasp,
So if there's a
essentially.
reductio, there should be something absurd about that. And I just don't, what's absurd about saying that that's not the case, that if there's a world where people are okay with baby torture, that they're getting something incorrect? Like, I'm against baby torture. So they're
Well, that
approving
was
of things
yeah.
that are inconsistent with my moral standards. I don't like that. But I don't think they're making any factual errors. I just think they
So
have unfortunate preferences.
yeah, and I think the that was why I was trying to unpack the reductio and say that, like, to me, this betrays a misunderstanding about the grounding of morality or the nature of morality, that like the moral status or the moral valence of that behavior could change in people's minds in that universe, that like they're not wrong about anything when they change their minds there in that universe, seems to me to misunderstand the nature of morality, and the hypothetical is sort of meant to highlight that fact. But that's what seems absurd to me, is to say that morality is grounded in anything other than the nature of the acts and the way that they impact people, rather than people's preferences or beliefs, specifically beliefs about them. Because the reason he says stance independent, for folks who haven't read Schaefer Landau, he wants to distinguish between, the idea that like moral truths can't take into account personal preferences, right? Like if we respect autonomy, then we can respect that like I have a personal preference to not eat meat, and I shouldn't be forced to eat meat or something like that. So our preferences can impact how people should treat us and how we treat other people, but they can't undermine those moral foundations that I pointed out earlier. Those moral foundations are just always true, no matter what anybody thinks about them, real or imagined.
Yeah,
That to me is the position.
I don't struggle to understand what it would mean for moral facts to be stance independent. I think there's other conceptual issues that I have with them, namely irreducible normativity. We could get to that. It's just that this different version of the thought experiment. The first one I think is ambiguous, and I don't think it would be a good question to ask people, because I think it fails to disambiguate the standard to which the question is supposed to be indexed. Is it the standard I would have were I a member of the group in that universe, or like my standard outside of the universe? And I've had arguments with people where they're like, no, you don't get to make a judgment outside of that universe. You have to judge only like within the universe. Okay, but I'm not like, if I'm not in the universe, then I can't judge. So it'd be like saying, on my view, moral facts express my preferences. So if you say, imagine there was a world in which you didn't exist, what would your preferences be? I wouldn't have any preferences. This is a nonsense question. So that would be nonsensical. So that wouldn't make any sense. And if you say, hey, there's a universe where people, like doing this or approve of doing that, what is your current preference? It's not going to change. So that question makes no sense. So the original question, doesn't cut any ice for me. But the second one that you've presented, I think it exposes what the question is getting at a little more directly. And then I think it loses its rhetorical punch once you do that. It just seems to be, I mean, you might as well at that point, I think, just ask me, do you think moral facts are stance independent? Because like, what's the point in bothering with other universes?
I think for non-philosophers, it's hard to make any sense of what that would look like or mean. And so giving the hypothetical allows them to kind of grasp the stakes a little bit, potentially. Maybe, and the fact that you and I do give like just discrete oppositional answers to that clarified version suggests that it might be parsing the issue a little better. It's just not compelling to you at all, which is fine because you're an anti-realist, right? Like I my hope is at least that it does at least clarify what I'm asking, right?
It absolutely clarifies it. Right. Yeah. Right. But I might be a little, I don't know what proportion of anti-realists that have thought about the issue, like people working in contemporary philosophy or that have really like read stuff, how many of them would report having realist intuitions but then like override them and endorse anti-realism anyway? I don't have realist intuitions, so nothing about that case is remotely compelling to me. And in fact, when I look at that case, the idea that they would be making a mistake, actually, it's not like I'm just neutral on it. It in fact does strike me as absurd. Like, so like the situation where I'm supposed to have the takeaway that it would be absurd to think that they're not making a mistake, I actually think it would be absurd to think they are making a mistake. So like I'm symmetrically situated in realist, like in intuition pumps that are supposed to prompt realism, with thinking the anti-realist response is the obvious response. Like what could be more obvious than this? And I stand by that. Like I really feel that way, that there's almost nothing to me that's more obvious than that realism is wrong. Like it's one of the most obviously wrong things I could think about. Like it seems more obviously wrong than like theism. It seems more obviously wrong than like Bigfoot exists. So like it just that just looks to be like a conceptual mistake. So if I were inclined to be a rationalist and employ like substantive a prioristic claims about things, I would just say as a conceptual matter, value claims or claims about what's right or wrong just are, conceptually speaking, claims that are indexed to some standard or other. And that it's like, I would be like a analytic anti-realist, right? I would just say, yeah, the realists just misunderstand how the concepts work. I don't endorse that view, but if I were employing the methodology, that's how it would seem to me. And I really am just saying that to express just how much realism is out of accord with the way I think about things at a very fundamental level.
Yeah, I understand that you're clarifying that. I think I would want to make sure, because I wouldn't put either realism or anti-realism anywhere the camp of like belief in Bigfoot. You know what I mean? Like belief in Bigfoot is a empirical claim that has no evidence for it and a bunch of evidence against it. Like there's strong reasons to not believe in Bigfoot. I think meta-ethical debates are much more complicated and nuanced, and there's much less clear evidence. Like I think there are arguments for and against, but I think you're right that they are not knockdown arguments for or against that are going to be compelling to everyone involved. And so like, if I was going to rank my assessment of your judgment and you told me, I'm an anti-realist, but I also don't believe in Bigfoot, I'd be like, well, it's probably better than if you were, a realist who does believe in Bigfoot. So I think they're different that way. But I take your point that like you and I attend different intuitionist churches, as one of my professors used to say, right? We just attend different services. Let me ask you this, maybe to help try to clarify a bit. You know, I tried to lay out why it seemed absurd to me that they wouldn't be making, that they are making a mistake, and someone would say they aren't. Why does it seem absurd to you to say they are making a mistake?
Like, why does it seem absurd? I think it's downstream of the way in which I understand the way human psychology works and how it fits into the broader. Sorry for StreamYard continuing to freeze like that. Into the broader framework of how I think human beings fit into our picture of the world as a whole. So I take a very holistic and abductive approach to thinking about philosophical issues. And it's downstream of this view that, okay, well, humans are these organisms that we're apes. We are a product of natural selection and cultural evolution. And we evolved to adapt to particular kinds of environments. I think that we occupy a kind of cultural niche, like our specialty is going through this long developmental period in which we're influenced by our parents and our surrounding culture and our peer groups to acquire the knowledge and skills that allow us to flexibly adapt to a wide range of novel environments. I mean, humans could literally live on Mars if we really invested the time, energy, and resources. You're not going to see dolphins doing that. So humans have this kind of biological and evolved specialization that's really pretty remarkable. Now, when I look at all of that, I then ask the question, well, what is morality in that sort of grand narrative of what humans are and how they fit into things? And I see morality as this culturally contingent social technology that people developed. And I think it's distinctive to particular cultures, not others. I think the evidence for this is not overwhelming, but it's, to me, I find it quite, I think it's more plausible than any competing hypotheses. So, I'm very much influenced by the work of Stephen Stitch and Edward Mashery. So Stephen Stitch argues that there
I
is
taught
no
with
moral.
Stephen Stitch.
Oh, cool.
I
Oh, yeah.
TA'd
So
for him.
that's very cool. Yeah.
Please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, so Stitch has this chapter in the Atlas of Moral Psychology called the moral domain, and he argues that there is no moral domain. He argues that there's no conceptual distinction between moral norms and non-moral norms, and that efforts from both philosophers and psychologists historically just failed. Talia Wheatley and Walter Sinnott Armstrong have a couple papers on the disunity of moral judgment, where they argue that there's no principled set of characteristics that distinguish moral judgments from non-moral judgments. And then Edward Mashery presents empirical evidence that if you look across different cultures, religious groups, and societies, that people don't categorize norms in the same way. There are even cultures that don't appear to lexicalize or have cognate terms for morality. They would have to import, borrow, or invent new terms to lexicalize what are fundamentally sort of Western Judeo-Christian monotheistic concepts. Mongolian is the go-to example that I would give people that does not appear to have had a cognate term. And so when I look at all that broad scope of that data, I think, okay, well, what is morality? Well, it's a kind of cultural quirk for people that are descended from or part of or heavily influenced by monotheistic cultures to draw this Manichaean division between good and bad, right and wrong, this dichotomy that I think is derivative of and downstream of certain sorts of cultural influences. It's a culturally acquired tendency. It's not deeply rooted in some deep rationalistic enterprise where we're grasping fundamental truths about reality through reasoning alone. And so the whole thing just looks to me to be just patently, just clearly, plain as day, a kind of cultural invention in the way that like fashion or an art movement, impressionism or cubism. I see morality as quite literally just like that, as a kind of culturally entrenched mode of thinking that doesn't actually map onto or carve nature at its joints or pick out any fundamental distinctions or divisions in the world. And so when I look at it through that stream, the question of whether there would be stance independent moral facts just never arises. There are all these descriptive facts about what the world is like and how we go about making predictions. And among those descriptive facts, there are facts about the norms, institutions, and judgment predispositions that human populations have developed. And I just see morality as just another of those, very much like a code of chivalry. I wouldn't be even remotely compelled to think some ancient code of chivalry is like capturing some deep fundamental facts about the way the universe is. It's just this cultural thing that arose among some population. And so when I look at morality, I'm kind of looking at it from an alien's like from this outsider
Mhm.
anthropologist perspective, where I'm seeing it as like, yeah, it's just this thing people came up with. And so I think that there's a pretty good historical narrative account that serves as a kind of cultural debunking argument for what's going on with morality, where at no point are there any observations that we make about what humans are doing or how we think or what's going on in the world that would require us to posit an extra type of fact to account for any sort of observations. So I guess the main reason would just be that realism strikes me as explanatorily superfluous. There's not any given set of observations that I think are best accounted for by positing the existence of stance independent moral facts. The real task for me would be to explain why some people think that there are stance independent moral facts. And that burden is heavily lifted by the empirical research that I've looked into, where I argue that most non philosophers are not moral realists, because instead of having to argue why all of humanity feels compelled to hold this position, what I'm really arguing is that uh, contemporary conceptions of moral realism are a kind of recent historical invention that is largely confined to certain sorts of academic disputes. And so it's like a few thousand people that I think are really in the know on these topics. And my real task is to explain where they're going wrong. And I think that's a lot easier task than explaining how all of humanity has gone wrong. I think I've said a whole lot there. There's a lot more I could say, but I think that should give a taste of where I'm coming from at this stuff. So basically, my judgments are on this being like obviously wrong are highly tuned by a wide array of background empirical considerations related to human psychology and history and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I love that because I think that was a very well put together description of what I would call the evolutionary debunking argument for moral realism. You cited several folks in the psychology world. The person I would associate this with is Sharon Street, who writes A Darwinian Dilemma for Realist Theories of Values, which is the paper that I wrote my master's dissertation on moral realism, trying to defend moral realism against. So literally the exact argument you just laid out is what I consider to be one of the strongest arguments against moral realism, which is why I focused on it in my dissertation. So before I try to object to it in any way, I just want to say, if we're listing quality of arguments here, like I do think this is a real challenge that moral realists have to face. Like it's a more sophisticated debunking argument than just moral weirdness is incompatible with physical materialism or something like that, right? It's a pretty sophisticated psychological evolution argument that I think has teeth, that I think is plausible as an objection. Obviously I don't agree with it, but yeah, I do think it is a good argument, and like you put it together quite well there. So how did I respond to it? Let's say, like, what do I think is the right way to go to push back on this? I read Street's argument, and I think your argument there as well, but correct me if I'm wrong, as being an epistemic access problem kind of argument. That
Well,
like,
that would be yeah, that
go
would
ahead.
be one. There's conceptual issues as well.
Okay,
But the other thing I just wanted to clarify is Street and other proponents of evolutionary debunking arguments tend to claim that like moral cognition evolved or moral judgments are heavily influenced by biological evolution, and I don't really think that. I think maybe evolution influenced our moral judgments, but I think evolution influenced all of our judgments about everything. So I don't really see
right.
that as any distinctive threat to morality. So I would that's why I think I called it this. I would prefer to call it a cultural debunking argument,
Okay,
not an
I
evolutionary
apologize. I tend to think of those things as being really the same thing, that like modern research collapses the nature nurture divide a lot of the way. It collapses like one of my favorite books on this is The Secret of Our Success. Heinrich's book about like what are the features of human beings that made it that we are the kind of creatures that might be able to go to Mars one day, and it's a bunch of these different capacities coming together, various kinds of luck, I would say, allowing us to do these kinds of things, including the development of culture, right? And culture is an evolutionary adaptation that then allows us to evolve, in a sense, much more rapidly than biological evolution would allow us to do. So when I say evolutionary debunking, I should say I mean both cultural and biological evolution. That like nothing in biology caused us to evolve a moral organ, right? Like an eyeball, right? And then culture, the argument would go, doesn't come along and suddenly provide us with the perfect ability to track the moral truth that we didn't already evolve the way we evolved eyesight, right? Like the reason we're realistic about physical objects that we can see is because we keep bumping into them and our eyes seem to be tracking where they exist pretty reliably, right? You don't bump into moral facts in quite the same kind of way. So, like, your body isn't evolving like a sense organ to perceive them, nor, and then, like, again, as you're saying, culture doesn't necessarily come along and like fix that problem by giving us a perfect moral sense. Um, so I like, and I think I would say that Street's argument is also includes a little bit of the cultural aspects as well, that like essentially morality comes along as a cultural adaptation that, you know, is good for pro-social creatures. It allows them to manipulate behavior, etc. And I think there's a sense in which that is true. Like I'm not here to really strongly disagree with that theory about the history of where our moral sense or our moral intuitions come from, right? Like I do think they come out of this mixed bag of culture gene coevolution essentially. But I think that's compatible with both there being moral truths and us having access to them.
Okay. So I guess I
Yeah.
would wonder, like, what if you disagree with the account I've given? I mean, there's a lot to it, and I haven't really unpacked it. It's quite a bit different in the details from Street's account. So I
Mhm.
don't know how you would specifically respond to my account, but you're welcome to give a response to like evolutionary debunking arguments in general. Like, what would be wrong with those? I should say though, like I might just agree with you that they have problems. Like I don't endorse conventional evolutionary debunking arguments. I don't find them very convincing.
But even the cultural debunking arguments, I think I also don't find super convincing because so here's the argument that I put in my dissertation. It's a in my master's one, it's a version of a partners in crime kind of argument, which I know is another argument that y'all covered in your tier list. And I think y'all generally consider to be amongst the better of the realist kinds of arguments. And in this particular case, um, the partners in crime argument I have is specifically targeted on the epistemic side, which is that like we also didn't, you know, evolve, nor is it like, nor is culture really putting into us a good sense of statistics, for example, or other kinds of things that we believe that we have knowledge about, math and logic and stuff like that. Yet I do think people believe that we can gain knowledge or understanding about those things through the capacities of reason, argument, what we're doing right here and now, essentially, right? That like through social processes, we can learn and understand things better. Maybe not all things, maybe some things we're just going to be mired in confusion forever, but like there can be progress made on those kinds of things. And so I think that these kinds of arguments don't present a unique epistemic problem for ethics. There may, as you say, be other conceptual problems with regard to grounding, but I don't think we have a unique epistemic concern when it comes to ethics.
Yeah, so the kinds of concerns that I raise are, in fact, by their very structure and design, specific to realist intuitions. So, like,
Mhm.
my concerns just would be specific to those. So, I don't have a problem with general human reasoning capacities. I have a problem specifically with people arriving at realist conclusions. Among other
Sure.
considerations, I mean, one of them would be like, I'm a pragmatist, and when I look at something like mathematics, well, on the pragmatist view, positions like proposed possible facts have to sort of earn the right to be truths through their use or their role that they play in the broader space of reasoning capacities and views and commitments that we have. It's this, this holistic picture of what the world is like. And for an idea to come along and to be accepted as true, it's got to do some work. And when it comes to mathematics, it easily passes that test. When it comes to the reasoning faculties that we have when they're employed in the sciences, Do they allow us to make predictions and achieve our goals in a reliable and consistent way? Absolutely. So chemistry works; it passes the test, the pragmatic test. Does biology pass that test? Yes. Does astronomy pass the test? Yes. And then when it gets to a lot of these ideas that philosophers have, these stance-independent moral facts, the question for me is, if there were stance-independent moral facts, what practical
Right.
difference would it make? And I think the answer is none whatsoever. It just wouldn't matter if there were facts of this kind. And so I don't take that to merely be an epistemic issue. So I'm not like, I don't consider myself an analytic philosopher, and I don't take metaphysics and epistemology to be quite so distinct from one another as I think a lot of analytic philosophers do. For me,
Hmm.
if something fails these pragmatic tests, like the metaphysics and epistemology are going to both be very intertwined. And the fact that I think that stance independent moral facts fail the pragmatic tests doesn't mean that I think that there could be these stance independent moral facts out there, but we just don't have access to them. It's a reason for me to think that they're just sort of they're ruled out from my framework for how I view the world. I just don't see any reason to posit their existence in the first place. But for a pragmatist, that means that like they're excluded from one's framework. Now, there the other issue, though, is not quite traditional pragmatism. It's a conceptual issue. And the conceptual issue I have is with this idea that the moral facts, it's not that they're stance independent, it's that they're irreducibly normative. So, on my view, I think that there's only descriptive facts. And when people report these intuitions saying that
Yeah.
um, these facts are like these moral facts are true independent of your goal standards values, fine. But I want to know what it means to say that the facts are normative. So, realists will tell me things like you should do this, even if it's inconsistent with your goal standards or values. And, I'm flabbergasted by what that could possibly mean, like even in principle. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about a conceptual issue. And I gave a name to this idea, which I call the unintelligibility thesis. Uh, I think the idea of irreducible normativity, like I'm not sure that it's meaningful. I'm not sure what it would mean for there to be these facts about what I should or shouldn't do, independent of what I want to do. I don't. What would that mean?
Yeah. Let's put a pin in the irreducible normativity for a second. And I just want to hit a couple of the things that you point out along the way there, because I think they're also valuable. Another like reasonable argument to raise against moral realism is the kind of ontological excess or profligacy. Like, you know, in a pragmatic sense, right? If we're going to fill our metaphysics with these moral values to go alongside our, empirical facts or whatever, you have to make a case for why, right? And this is, I think, the closest we get in this argument to there being a burden of proof that, like, I think the moral realists tend to have a bit of a burden of proof in trying to explain, because they're trying to add more to the ontology in that sense. And I think we are all in a place now of not wanting to add more unless you absolutely have to, right? Um, so I'm sympathetic to that concern, and I do think that these things have an impact on the world. So I think the answer to the question of like the pragmatic question, is they help us understand the nature of things. And I think that would also be true of anti-realism. So if you took that pragmatist argument and turned it around on anti-realism and said, what is the impact of anti-realism on the world? If it turned out that there were no moral facts, how would that impact the world? You might also say it wouldn't in the least, potentially. So I'm not sure that I think that like realism is particularly like failing on the pragmatism front, so much as sometimes so much as the irreducible normativity thing adds another layer of complexity and problems.
I'm very
Let me
sorry.
just
Can
also
you give
add,
me a moment?
yeah, go ahead.
I
Sure.
have something that came up that I have to address right now. I'm really
Yeah,
sorry about
please
that.
go do the thing. Yeah, no, go for it. Take
Right.
your
It's
time.
only going to take me a couple minutes. I'm really sorry about that.
I understand. I'll just take questions from the chat. What's up, chat? How's it going, chat? Dog's domain. I think I had a bunch of questions. Let's see here. Probably save the $2 one, I guess. I guess to answer some of your questions about like how my perspective expands to other things, like I'm a moral realist, and I think like something I was going to add there is that I think morality is different from other evaluative things to some extent. Like I think aesthetic realism is a separate complicated question. I'm not necessarily an aesthetic anti-realist, but I don't think the arguments for aesthetic realism are the same as the arguments for moral realism. And like gastronomical realism, I don't think is a thing. I think that morality has a specific feature to it in terms of it being related to harms and benefits, and the way that those, like mental states of sentient beings, things like that, that make it objective in a way that the other ones aren't. And as far as different types of moral principles, I'm pretty open to everything. Like I think you can talk about morality in terms of what is good and bad, right and wrong. I think most of the moral frameworks have something important to them that is worth considering in your judgments. He's back.
Hey, sorry about that. I had apparently I had to sign something, and I had to sign it immediately. So I hope I
Understood.
got that taken care of. Yeah, of course. It had to happen right in the middle of a stream. Like I'm sitting
Always.
around all day, but it happens right now. Apparently, it was extremely time sensitive. I'm really sorry about that. It sounds like you're holding down the fort, talking to the chat.
Yeah, I was just chatting up with the chat a little bit, trying to
Cool. Okay.
backfill some questions.
Yeah, they're a very lively group. So I'd be happy to do that. But how much time do you have? Because I've got a bit more time. I feel like we're just getting into some of the good stuff.
Yeah, I can go a little longer. I can go
Cool.
at least another 40 minutes.
Yeah, can you bring us back to where you were at with what you were saying? Because I got
Yeah,
real distracted by that. I'm really sorry about that.
no problem at all. Basically what I was saying was I think the pragmatism argument that you're presenting there is not, it's like a useful argument, but I wonder if it would get the same answer whether you applied it to any kind of meta ethics in a
Right. So I could
sense.
say something about that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't I fall outside the scope of any of the traditional anti-realist views. I don't endorse error theory or non-cognitivism or expressivism or any of them. I've settled for now on calling my position anti-realist quietism, and I'm borrowing from the quietist tradition in that ultimately I think that the realist anti-realist dispute should be resolved because I don't think that there's really a legitimate dispute to have in the first place. I think that the central conceptual disputes are probably the result of conceptual confusions and are largely meaningless, and that the proper solution I would ultimately favor would be to step away from the dispute as a whole. So
Hmm.
really, I'm a quietist. Someone could say, well, you can't be a quietist and an anti-realist. I've had people tell me that, like, you can't take both positions. Uh,
Sure.
there's a sense in which you might say that that's true, but I think it's important to um, use the term anti-realist to say what I'm not okay with. And what I'm not accepting are the certain terms, concepts, and distinctions. Well, I have problems with the terms, concepts, and distinctions, but there's certain sorts of conceptual and metaphysical excesses that realists endorse that I want to make clear. I'm not accepting those, but I'm also not endorsing a substantive anti-realist position within the traditional analytic framework. So, for instance, one of my big problems with error theory is I think that it rests on mistaken presuppositions about the way language and meaning work. So I don't endorse the semantic thesis behind error theory. So I'm not an error theorist. So ultimately, I'm a quietist about this sort of thing. And so someone
Hmm.
saying, yeah, anti-realism can't handle or pass pragmatic tests either. Well, I'm just saying I don't think there's stance independent moral facts. That doesn't have to handle anything because it's a negation of a position. So it's not supposed to do work. The fact that I'm an anti-realist is a just sort of byproduct of the fact that I'm not a realist. It's not like there's not like a substantive anti-realist framework in there.
No, I
I mean,
understand.
other than
In the
a
same way that I
very
imagine
marginal
you're
one.
an illusionist, and for similar reasons, probably.
Yeah. So
My
the position I endorse is qualia quietism. So I actually endorse a quietistic position of a qualia as well.
yeah. Whereas I am in a like this is a like Episcopalians versus Methodism at this point. Like I'm a Mysterian about like the hard problem of consciousness, but also I believe that phenomenal consciousness necessarily definitely exists. So like in the same way that you are a quietist, but also you're an anti-realist, I'm a Mysterian, but also a realist about phenomenal consciousness. I'm a little bit less of a Mysterian about morality. I do think it is still a little bit mysterious. Like I think it's hard to kind of get around the idea of stance independent moral facts and to think about how they are statements about the universe. I mean, I think I'm not a good Kantian, but like the Kantian ideas trying to parse synthetic a priori truths as a path between a priori and empirical claims. I do think that morality exists in that kind of weird space. So one other thing I wanted to clarify is, while I make a partners in crime argument on the epistemic side about things like math and logic, I don't think that morality is like math and logic. I think they're different things. I think you can be a realist about morality and an anti-realist about math. My argument is just, if you're an anti-realist about morality because of the debunking kinds of arguments that we were discussing, then you probably need to be a global anti-realist, which I think is something that you're sympathetic to as well.
Yeah, it's not just sympathetic. It's a full-blown endorsement of global normative anti-realism. So I don't think that there are any stance-independent normative facts. But the thing is, you had mentioned before people saying that they'll bite the bullet on the scenario that you described. I don't think that I do, because I have issues with it. But I don't think normative anti-realism involves biting bullets. So, in order for something to be an instance of biting a bullet, I would also have to agree that it carries some theoretical cost, or I'm paying some price to endorse the view. But I don't think that normative anti-realism pays any prices. So I don't think the view bites any bullets. I don't really think it has any problems. So, like people that will present companions and guild arguments, and I don't know if you endorse this, will argue that if you're a global normative anti-realist, then your position is self-defeating, because you wouldn't have any reasons or justification for endorsing the normative anti-realism in the first place. But I don't accept that I require stance independent normative facts to justify my positions. So I don't see the position as self-defeating. So like I don't have to. So I both reject normative epistemic realism, and I reject that I would need epistemic realism in order to justify things. I just reject both instead of just one.
Yeah, and I wouldn't try to make that self-defeating argument either. My position would more be like, I think moral realism is true. I think the next most likely true position is global anti-realism, and then anti-realism about morality while maintaining realism about these other things. Like, that's the worst position in my mind, right? But I assume that like a global anti-realist is going to come up with some sort of constructivist or some other kind of way to back up whatever they believe on anti-realist foundations. Like, I don't think that because you become a global anti-realist, you're going to turn into a Pyrrhonian skeptic and wander in front of a cart or something. I think like if I wanted to push back on anti-realism, I think that anti-realism has a hard time. So like, what are the implications of that hypothetical, right? Some would argue the implications are that it makes it difficult to be not a relativist about normative truth. And maybe you're saying that that's fine, you're a relativist about normative truth. I think relativism about normative truth is very problematic and leads to relativism about applied ethics, which is problematic.
Well, what would the problems be? Like, so on my view, what would I run into any like, oh no, I'm not justified, or oh no, I can't do, like, are there any practical problems with being an anti-realist, about like a global normative anti-realist, on your view?
This is something I think we got into on our episode as well. So I apologize if we're going to retread ground here, but I think like for the people who do perceive that hypothetical as biting a bullet, I know you don't. The anti-realists who do perceive it as such, I think they see a concern that there is some degree to which you can't say, these other people who have very strong different preferences from me are still bound by the same moral truths or moral laws or moral principles that I believe that I myself am bound by. And then you can have different degrees of like what follows from that. Does that mean that I can't intercede when they're acting immorally? Obviously, some people are going to say, well, I can still intercede. It's just going to be ruled by the boot, and your moral realism doesn't help at all in any of this. So, like, this doesn't prove anything either way, I think is the way the objections kind of back and forth are going to go there.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I would say. So for me,
much,
there's just,
right.
yeah, there's no consequence to this. So, like, one question I like to ask realists, and I guess I'll ask you, is suppose it turned out that moral realism was false, like you, and it's, sorry, not just that it's false, but that you come to believe that it's false. Would that change your outlook or your behavior in any way? I mean, maybe that's not a hypothetical you could readily put yourself in, but how much of a difference do you think it would make to you, to the best of your ability to imagine that scenario?
Um, I don't know, and I think like I don't have a great sense of how to imagine that scenario or have strong intuitions about what would happen to me in that scenario. This is, I think, less a pure theoretical argument and almost more of a like going back to the history of how these concepts have been used in various ways for various permission structure kind of arguments. So I think what I see is, for a lot of people, anti-realism turns into a kind of simplistic cultural relativism, but they mean it in the nicest way possible. You know, like they're going for like, other people have different cultures with different morals and different preferences, and so maybe I shouldn't judge them and their cultures and that kind of thing. And the kind of like the anthropological principle that originates as, I think, a mechanism for correcting for our biases becomes itself a kind of normative view that people buy into and object to things that seem like violations of that kind of respect for cultural diversity or something like that, right?
Yeah, but those aren't logical entailments of being an anti-realist. That's like a thing, contingent features of the way human psychology interacts with anti-realism. If you're an anti-realist, maybe you would become more morally complacent. Maybe you're more okay with people doing terrible things overseas, that sort of thing, relative to a realist. But it could be the case that if we go out and we explore and we look at how people respond to becoming a realist, maybe they
Sure.
become more rigid or intolerant in ways that you and I would agree are bad. But it
Hmm.
wouldn't be a good reason to reject realism as such. It would just be a reason to like criticize people for mishandling their commitment to realism. And I would just say the same about people mishandling the commitments to anti-realism. When I see, I mean, one of my last videos is something like anti-realists suck at defending anti-realism. I see anti-realists all the time say things like that are worse than what you've described. So, if there's a culture that practices genocide, would it be morally wrong? And they're like, no, different folks, different strokes or something. Wait, so you're not against genocide? What? So when realists are objecting to anti-realists that go in for these crude types of cultural relativism where they endorse these normative principles of tolerance or indifference or non-intervention, depending on what the non-intervention is, I'm not going to intervene to like impose my music preferences on other people or trivial, like, no, everyone in England's driving the right side of the road. I'm not going to like impose trivial stuff on people, but I am perfectly okay with if there's a culture that's practicing slavery or genocide to the greatest extent possible to get them to not do that. And that's completely consistent with anti-realism.
Yeah, so I feel like there's a problem here that I don't think it's intentional. I don't think you're like trying to trick me on this one, but like this is something that I think comes up sometimes where we start with one question, which is, what is your view and like why do you believe it's true? And then we at some point come to a more pragmatic question about like what are the implications if it is true or whether it wasn't true or something like that, right? So I want to reiterate my reasons for believing that moral realism are true is because I think it best describes the world as far as I understand and experience the world, right? If it was the case, as you showed, that like psychologically moral realism made people worse people, I wouldn't think that made it not true. I think that would just be a problem that we needed to address because I think it is true. And I generally am in favor of people believing true things as opposed to false things. I'm pretty anti-noble lies across the board. So when we get into questions of like, what are the implications in the world, though, we do end up in a place about talking about human psychology. What does it mean if people believe these different kinds of things? And I do think those questions are important, but we shouldn't ever forget that they're not the reason. They're not an argument for the position. They're an argument about what could happen as a result of the position, which can then potentially be an argument for the position if you think the outcomes are better or worse. But it isn't an argument, I think, for it being true. It's more an argument for like, we would like it to be true, right? It would be here's why it'd be better if it was true, right? let me give one other example for like psychology, just to like tie it to something real. I give talks about this sometimes in secular spaces, and I have a paper about this specifically in relation to the immoral non-believer stereotype that I mentioned earlier. Atheists are atheist non-believers, anybody in that broad category, are portrayed as less ethical, less trustworthy in particular, because they're not religious, and they are perceived that way. And several arguments are used to try to reinforce that perception. And one of those arguments is this like atheists can't have real morality kinds of arguments. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of atheists, because they don't have good counter arguments there, feel compelled to buy that idea, and in doing so, to some extent, internalize a kind of harmful stereotype about their community. And so my view is, one benefit, one real world psychological implication of promoting moral realism in secular communities is it gives them tools to push back against shitty theistic arguments that might make them feel like they can't have a real robust morality. And this is really important because I've genuinely talked to a fair number of people who are like, when I left religion, I thought I had to leave morality, because they were always taught that morality was associated with religion, and they kind of spiraled into what we would think of as like a harmful anti-realist place, right? Like, if nothing, like nothing is real, everything is permitted, Aleister Crowley kind of places, right? And they do self-harm and harm to others in the process before reconstituting a more functional morality, right? So I think helping people to have arguments for realism that show them that it can be compatible with their atheist worldviews can give them some ability to push back on that stuff. And that is a benefit, even if they aren't fully converted to moral realism, right? Even if they still stay anti-realists, that can be one way, I think, to shield them from those kinds of harmful stereotypes.
Yeah, I don't want to digress too much on that topic, but what I can say is I also think that we could just equip anti-realists to give better responses to the kinds of
Sure.
arguments that realists give. And a lot of what I'm doing with
Kagan's approach with William Lane Craig.
Yeah, so it's just different approaches. The other thing, though, is that I actually do, like, when I ask, like, if this view was true or false, like, what difference would that make for your behavior? How would you react to that? That's downstream of my pragmatist inclination. So for me, part of what's important in establishing whether a view is true is whether it's being, a candidate for the truth relative to some alternative position would or could make any observable difference in principle, like that you could actually encounter or experience. So if the truth of realism would not and could not make any observable difference to our experiences or what happens in the world or something like that, that would actually be a reason for me to reject the view. So at least on my view, we're probably operating within different metaphilosophical approaches. That actually would be a reason to be concerned about whether the view is true. Maybe it wouldn't be for you. So consequences matter, on my view, in a certain sort of round.
So there.
I think I got cut off there.
Consequences matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that I understand that pragmatic position. I'm thinking about how I would respond. So it's a good question, and I want to think about how to like actually address it. But let me try to sort of mirror back your argument here a little bit, and doing so process through it some here, right? So I could see an argument go, the truth that the world is made of electrons or atoms or something like that impacts our world because it impacts the physical things in the world. If we know that truth, we can manipulate the world to change outcomes or something, right? There's no way in which moral truths serve a similar kind of function, where because we gain access to the moral truths, we're better able to manipulate our world and thereby have better outcomes. Is that kind of the argument?
Yeah, it's something like that. I mean, one way to put it would be if there were two scientific theories that you just swap out the terminological labels for all the content of them, but they're otherwise make exactly the same predictions. I wouldn't say that one could be true and one could be false. I would just say it's the same theory. And so if moral realism and moral anti-realism like don't make different predictions or expectations about what the world is like or what experiences we would expect to have, I don't know like what the motivation for being a moral realist would be. And so either moral realist can point to some sort of pragmatic differences, or at the very least, realism seems to fail a sort of conventional pragmatic test of whether it actually picks out a distinct position at all.
Yeah. So my first instinct, I think, would be to reject that pragmatism test, I think. And I would want to say that certain things are true in a meaningful way that doesn't need to meet that test. And then I would probably go looking for partners in crime, if we're being real honest here.
Mhm.
Like that's probably the argument that I would try to run there, is that I think some truths can be assessed on that approach, but some truths can't. And that like it's not a fault against moral realism in this kind of sense. I do think that moral realism and anti-realism are distinct positions. Maybe we go back to the irreducible normativity. Maybe that's a way to
Sure.
ground us in a difference again here, right? Because I do think there is a difference here potentially between us, in that I don't have intuitive disgust towards irreducible normativity. Like, I'm fine with irreducible normativity at the end of the day. I think the universe just contains irreducible normativity.
But what even is it?
It's the moral truths. Like, it's like asking what really is the speed of light. It's just a description of the universe.
Yeah, but see, with the speed of light, like we could like do stuff with light, like we could like shoot photons and test the speed of
Sure,
things, and
we
like they
can
figure in the
torture
scientific
animals.
models. Right, but at what point when you're torturing animals am I observing irreducible normativity? Like it's never. I
So
don't need to posit it to
the
account for any
observing question is
observation.
complicated, right? So observing is where things get really messy, I think. Um, and this gets back to our naturalism, non-natural distinction, because I think a lot of times when people say natural, what they mean is observable by the natural sciences, right? They mean it's in some way has an observable effect on what we consider the natural part of the universe, right? But I don't think any mental properties here's my partners in crime. It's mental states, which of course you're going to hate, but like I think there are truths about mental states that are not testable by the natural sciences that are true, but even if it turned out that illusionism was in some way correct, like I don't go that way with it, but like, yeah, I think my partners in crime argument probably runs towards psychological facts and truths as having similar pragmatic problems, but still being real and important.
Yeah, I'd probably reject those too, though. So
Right,
that's going to be
right.
an issue here. So
Yeah, sure.
it's a whole. I could modus tollens my whole way to rejecting everything else that you're going to propose, and I don't
Right.
think we're going to locate any inconsistency. And then that's going to start to worry me, because if you have two competing philosophical. Oh, the freezing is real bad today. Damn you,
I
StreamYard.
know.
If you have two competing philosophical accounts of the world, and they end up making, like, if you and I go about the world and I like have my philosophical framework and you have your philosophical framework, and we do all the same things, there's no observable differences between how we solve problems or do anything. Uh, there starts to look to be something kind of hollow and superfluous about our respective philosophical positions, where it's not even a question of whether it's, quote unquote true, but who cares? Like, why does it matter? Now that might seem like a lower tier, like a cruder philosophical concern to have, but I don't think so. If the best thing you could say about a philosophical account is that technically it's true, but then I ask, okay, but what's it do? And the answer is it doesn't do anything. That's not a very interesting theory. And so my objection, this is a whole objection I have to a lot of the naturalist accounts of moral realism, which is that they end up engaging in what strikes me as a bunch of semantic shenanigans to say that there's these moral facts and they map onto certain sorts of descriptive facts, but they don't have any of, you know, what the various terms that anti-realists and realists alike have objected to them for lacking. They lack clout, normative authority, practical oomph. They don't do anything. So like if you told me, like, take something like Sam Harris's account, I think we could both probably scoff at that as a completely hollow and empty thing. Hey, moral facts are facts about well-being. The you know, well-being can be understood as these certain sorts of empirically discoverable facts, and so there's facts about what increases the well-being and decreases well-being. Boom, there's your moral facts. Well, I agree. There's
Right.
facts about what increases or decreases well-being. Now what do I do? Like what now? And so I have this concern that I even think that sort of superfluity, superfluousness, I can't even speak anymore, like that like emptiness applies to the non-naturalist accounts. I hate when that happens, like I'm in a stream for 2 hours and I can't talk anymore. My concern with like the non-normative moral facts is, let's say that there were these non-normative moral facts, why would
Mhm.
I care? Like it, you know, so from my perspective, I take something, I'm not a Humean, but I have roughly, my view is that like voluntary action is just action that's goal directed. It's goal oriented. And so I act on my goals and values. If these stance independent moral facts, if I discovered what they were, if they align with my values, I would have done them anyway. So they're not motivationally relevant. If they don't align with my values, I'm not going to do them. Like, you know, I would have no interest in doing them. And so the stance
You don't think
independent
they
moral
can
facts,
you don't think you can improve your values?
I don't know what that would mean. They're like, if these things are external to my goals and interests, I just don't have any interest in complying with them. Like, why would I want to do what's moral?
Well, so there's two questions there. One is, why would these be compelling psychologically? And the other is there such a thing as better and worse preferences or values, and such that an individual's preferences or values can improve because they are confronted by the moral truths?
Yep. Yeah. So I would just say no to the second one. I already forgot, what was the first one?
Whether they're psychologically compelling.
Yeah, I mean, that just would strike me as an empirical question. Like, it could be if I
Sure.
became a realist and I started to believe that there were moral facts that would somehow move me. I don't think so, though. I think other features of my views about human psychology would have to change, or I'd have to be inadvertently wrong about them, even if I didn't realize it. But you know, are you like a motivational internalist? Do you think knowledge of moral facts is necessarily motivating to some defeasible degree?
Um, it's been a while since I've done the internalism externalism discussion. But I certainly lean in that direction, probably in the sense of thinking that, like, you know, I mean, like I'm a virtue ethicist at the end of the day. I think moral psychology is about yoking your pleasures and desires to the good, like, and so I only think they're going to be as psychologically motivating as you've been habituated to take them as psychologically motivating. I
Okay.
think that's what virtue ethics does, literally. Um, but I also think that, like, there are better and worse things to be habituated to be motivated towards or to prefer. And that's where it seems like that second question is where I think you and I really diverge, and where I think there is a meaningful difference between realism and anti-realism is, I think there are better and worse preferences, and that people can get better over time in their preferences. And it sounds like you're saying you don't.
Yeah, I don't think that.
Okay.
Not in any
Well,
non-relative sense, of course.
yeah. So what I think is that, like, there are facts of the matter about what people should want or not want, or do or not do, and whether or not those facts are motivating to them, they are true facts.
Okay. Yeah, you know, at least some realists are going to reject motivational internalism, and that would raise some concerns for me, because if it's possible for me to just not care about the facts, then that's going to raise another question about whether they do anything. Like, okay, so there's these facts, so what? But if you're more inclined towards internalism, I'd start to have some concerns about the psychology there. Like, I would wonder whether internalism requires certain psychological assumptions, either about humans happen to be, or about how any possible agent would have to be, that like can we test them? Like, is internalism subject to any sort of empirical evaluation, or is it a kind of analytic claim? Like, what's going on with internalism?
So by internalism, do you mean that moral facts are motivating or action guiding?
Yes, that they're necessarily motivating to at least some degree, even if it's defeasible.
I don't love the term necessary in an empirical context like this.
Okay.
I feel like, right? I think they are. Let me put it this way: for evolved pro-social creatures like us, they tend to have some motivational efficacy. I think we are by nature inclined to experiences of fairness and unfairness, for example. But like, is it like a fundamental property of them that they will actually motivate people to some degree? No, it's a fundamental property of them that they should motivate people to some degree, but not
Okay.
that they successfully will motivate people to some degree. No.
That would look like, so I would say that that would be externalism then. So
Okay.
because like the way I take the internalist view would be to say something like, look, either you are somewhat motivated, even if defeasibly, or you don't actually have the moral belief in question. Like it's got to be there.
So another
Which
version of the internalism externalism debate that as I understand it, is it the moral fact itself that's motivating, or is it just your preferences and desires that are motivating? Right. And what I think is, while psychologically we should be yoking our preferences and desires to the moral truth, ideally, what that results in is the kind of intrinsic motivated behavior towards the moral truth, such that in situations where it directly conflicts with your desires and preferences, you're still motivated by the moral truth.
okay. Yeah, I think I've deviated a bit from this question of irreducible normativity though. For me,
Mm,
when I look at concepts, I take claims like should or shouldn't, good or bad. I understand those to be intelligible if they're cashed out in terms of relations between desires or goals or standards or whatever, and some means of acting in accord with them. So to say that I should get a glass of water would be something, it would mean something like it would satisfy the goal of quenching my thirst to get a glass of water. And so for me, I can understand those claims when they are reduced to a descriptive claim. Now, that's not to
mm,
say that I'm offering some sort of semantic analysis of non philosophers. Like, I'm not proposing that this is in fact what people mean when they say you should get a glass of water or you shouldn't torture babies. And so there's a distinction between what I think is like sensible or philosophically defensible and what ordinary people are doing. And I have to flag that because all these like standard anti-realist and realist views cash themselves out in terms of this sort of analysis of ordinary language. And I'm not trying to do that. I'm
sure.
just trying
Me
to get
neither.
at,
Fuck
yeah,
ordinary
I'm
language.
just trying to get at like what the concepts could mean. I'm engaged in a kind of
Sure.
normative or dialectical enterprise with philosophers. For realists, though, that believe in irreducible normativity, normative concepts can't be fully reduced to descriptive facts in that way. And that's where I get off the boat because if they're not like, I can make sense of descriptive facts. I'm not sure what it would mean for something to be a irreducibly normative fact, to be a normative fact, like it's just a fact that you should do this. When I've asked realists what that means, I just don't get what I take to be satisfactory responses. Do you think that they're some of them would just say, like Parfit says this on What Matters. He says, there's not really a non-circular way for me to articulate what this means, at least verbally, in On What Matters. Maybe he thinks it's communicable by others, some other means. But others try to give accounts. I don't find any of them satisfactory. Do you have a take on whether they're like unanalyzable or primitive, or do you think that they are communicable and that one could, in principle, give an account of them?
Yeah. So let's take like the moral foundations kind of things that I was pointing to earlier, like all things being equal, one ought to promote flourishing or reduce suffering. So flourishing and suffering would be these thick evaluative concepts that we could argue are irreducible, in the sense that you can unpack what those mean for specific individuals in specific cases, but there's no more argument to be had about the nature of suffering itself when trying to explain why, all things being equal, one ought to reduce suffering. Right? There's a kind of sense in which there's a demand that the realist gives some further step in the argument, and this is where the foundational, like it's whether it's foundational or coherent circularism, whatever you want to call it, right? All I'm saying is there's nothing else to be said beyond trying to understand the concept of flourishing and its sort of intrinsic to be doneness, to paraphrase Mackey, right? Like these things just fundamentally have to be doneness or to be avoidedness, or however you want to cash out intrinsic normativity in them, in these truths, in these the things that they are describing. And there's not anything further that we can unpack, especially descriptively, that would explain why that is true. All of the further descriptive or empirical work is going to go into like figuring out, what is flourishing for human beings and how to help them not suffer versus animals, etc., other animals, non-human animals.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what it would mean for something to have to be doneness. Like what does that mean?
So, yeah, I mean, what it means is it has intrinsic motivation in the sense that if you understand flourishing, you should understand, like should here, right? Like not necessarily will, but should understand it to be something that you ought to promote and not something that you ought to prevent.
Right. So you're using those terms should and ought. But again, like I would just ask, well, okay, then what do those mean in this context?
They
Like
mean
I
won't
ought
engage
to
in
promote flourishing.
behaviors. Right. So I ought to promote flourishing means I ought to engage in behaviors that promote flourishing.
Right. But what does the ought mean?
It means that like if I'm given a choice between doing it and not doing it, I should do it.
Right. So the concern I'm having is that there's a circularity here. Like you're saying ought, should. I genuinely
Yeah.
don't know what the terms mean in the context in which you're using them. And
I don't think they mean
a lot
anything
of people.
mysterious in this context. I think they mean like if you're holding a gun pointing it at somebody, right? And you ask me, should I shoot them or not? And I say no, you're going to understand what I mean. You're going to understand that I mean don't take that action.
Well, don't take that action would be like an imperative. So that I can
Sure.
understand. But I
Sure.
don't take irreducibly normative facts to be imperatives. That like we're not expressivists here. Like we're not
Right. So
endorsing Aaron Bear's
if you
analysis.
said why shouldn't I shoot him, and I said because it'll cause suffering or unnecessary suffering, to be more precise, right? Like then I'm explaining to you, I'm further unpacking, like the implications of those fundamental principles, but I'm not defending the principles themselves, right? And if you ask me, well, why shouldn't I promote suffering? That's where I agree with Nagel that like there's just not a lot else to say, and that may feel like insufficient to you. And I don't want to pretend that I have a further answer there that will be satisfying to you, and I'm hiding the football. Like I think that's as far as the debate goes, and that doesn't mean that you're a sociopath for not understanding. It just means that like I don't feel like I have any way to reliably convince someone of the normative truth of something other than pointing to an example of it or multiple examples of it in the world and saying, see, this is what happens, right? This is why you should do this and none should not do this. And it's like every time you look at those things and they bring out in you those emotive reactions, you are becoming more aware of those fundamental truths.
Right. So look at things from my point of view.
Mm-hmm.
The terms, no one appears to be able to explain the terms to me in a satisfactory way. They give these circular accounts. I don't appear to have access to them. They say that there's nothing further that could be said. Uh, what am I supposed to do? Like,
I think you do have
I don't,
access to them.
I don't think that I do.
Right.
Like,
But there we just disagree, right? Like I think you have
so,
access to them and you think you don't.
right. But like, no one can even tell me what it is I'm supposed to have access to. So
Well, you have
like, I'm
access to
using,
the moral truths. You have access to the
yeah, but I
fact
don't
that
know.
all
Once we unpack what you apparently mean by that, you can't explain it to me. So apparently,
I mean,
like
I
you're
think
using words, but I don't know what the words are referring to.
I think that's a problem that any explanation can be tagged with
But
endlessly,
I don't think
right?
so. But I
I
don't
think
think so.
I mean, what I think is that like,
One moment. The dog is going wild. Sorry for the
sure,
interruption.
yeah, no problem.
Barking at squirrels. Sorry.
No worries. And I don't know if you want to spend any time taking any questions as well before we run out of time.
Yeah,
As
maybe we should do that because we're going to run out of time.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think like it's okay for us to just have very strong differing intuitions here, I think, at the end of the day, and like may not have a knockdown argument one way or the other. I do think there is I can comprehend the concepts. I do think I'm able to convey them to some degree to people by allegory and other such methods. But I may not be able to instill in someone some perception or understanding that they don't have, and that I'm not sure that that's a fault against my argument or against their psychology.
Yeah, I think it is. So, I mean, the first is that I actually don't think that there are incommunicable concepts. I think that all concepts are communicable by their very nature. Like, I think that's part of what it means to be a concept. Now, I'm not trying to make an analytic claim here that I would stand. You could just say, okay, well, I'm using some schmoncepts. They're not concepts. Fine. But what I want to know is if there is any content to what's being expressed. And when a person can't communicate the concept, I start to wonder what in principle would be the difference between meaningful concepts, the proponents of which cannot communicate what they mean. They can't express or articulate or describe what they mean. And like a person that's conceptually confused and is using language but isn't actually saying anything at all. And I give people
Sure.
examples like the Jabberwocky. Like I could say, "'Twas brillig in the slithy toves to gyre and gibble in the wave." I'm using sounds. It sounds
Right.
superficially like I'm asserting things, but nothing is being asserted. And so when someone says in these contexts, "You should do this," or "You ought to do this," and then like nothing further can be said, what I want to know from an outside perspective is how could I distinguish that from instances in which people are saying "'twas brillig in the slithy toves"? If there's no standards or criteria like that anyone can offer me, and perhaps they can, uh, I start to wonder: is it
I do think there are
possible
standards and criteria. I don't think moral realism precludes standards and criteria, though.
standards and criteria for distinguishing the meaningfulness of those concepts from meaningless concepts, like pseudo concepts?
Yeah. Yeah,
What
I
would the
think so.
standards be?
Like, I mean, we can go with pragmatism, for example. So, like, let's take the word flourishing, right? If I
Mhm.
show you two trees, okay, and one of those trees is like really clearly not doing well and like hanging on for dear life kind of thing, and another tree is like vibrant and growing, and I say, look, this tree is flourishing, this one isn't. Do you feel like you understand what I mean by flourishing in that context?
Yes, but I would understand it to be a descriptive claim. There
So
wouldn't
I
be
would
any irreducible normativity.
I would describe it as a value laden claim that includes sort of irreducible normativity about the nature of that entity and the nature of flourishing, broadly speaking.
See, I wouldn't. And so then it feels like the concept is being hidden behind things that I understand differently. And I'm still not getting access to the concept. And it really worries me when people are employing language that's referencing concepts. Now, some people will say I'm conceptually impoverished, but I don't know that there's a good case to be made that I am just uniquely incapable of understanding these concepts, rather than that the people employing the terms that purport to pick out the concepts have fallen prey to a particular like verbal framing and dialectical like setup in which they and others have adopted certain ways of speaking, some forms of discourse that purport to pick out concepts but are actually failing to do so. I think that should at least be on the table as a live possibility.
Oh,
um,
absolutely.
and so the problem is, it's not that I'm like convinced that this is true, it's that I I stand in a sort of epistemic impasse with people that appeal to these concepts, where I don't think I have good reasons to think I'm completely delusional. Um, I also don't think I've given them good reasons for them to think they're delusional, because if you're occupying that first person perspective and you're like, "Look, I get it," so what more is there to do? I don't know how to bridge that impasse.
Hmm.
So that really concerns me. I think there's something funky going on. Um, and I think it like we need to explore philosophical methodology itself. Like, you said you're an ethical intuitionist earlier, and I really worry about whether like intuitions, in the sense that like humor thinks that they're intuitions. I'm not convinced that those are actually a real type of psychological state. So like the skepticism for me
Sure.
goes very deep with the fundamental philosophical methods that you and I are employing. Like I really am approaching this from a very different perspective than you. And I think it makes it difficult to have these conversations.
Um, that is very possible. And like, I think it's very possible that there is substance to this disagreement and a fact of the matter about who's right about it. And we could also still be stuck spinning our wheels in this kind of way, right? I don't think it's
Yeah.
dispositive one way or the other as to whether this is meaningful conversation or not, because I think this is just the nature of incredibly complex concepts and the difficulty of saying all the things before you say anything. For example, there are a lot of questions that have come up or comments that have come up in the chat that like we just haven't had a chance to clarify, but that like there's a lot of, I think, people hear very different things when we're talking about these kinds of topics. And like, again, that's not a fault on them either. I think everyone is coming to this with various challenge with, like, wow, I have weird deja vu now when I'm talking about this. I think we're all coming to this with our experiences and our understandings and the arguments that have been given to us, and we're trying to make the best of our understanding of it. And because I don't think there is a clear knockdown argument here, the way there is a clear knockdown argument about the speed of light, for example, it can be okay that we end up in a place of disagreement while still, I think, clarifying things. For example, I think a lot of times we have been on the same page, even while having very different perspectives, right? We've agreed about like which arguments are bad on both sides for the most part. Like we've agreed about which arguments seem like genuine challenges for both sides. Things like, realism, global anti-realism versus moral realism being the kind of better options as opposed to the mixed view. Like that does feel like still progress in the discussion to me, which suggests to me there is still something meaningful going on here. We may still just have some fundamental disagreements about things like intrinsic normativity. And I'm just willing to be really honest and say, I can't give perfect answers to all of the concerns about intrinsic normativity, but it is something that, like with consciousness, I feel like I experience it. And so it feels real to me. I'm a phenomenologist on that front.
Yeah, I do appreciate that, even if privately you think I'm a big dum-dum, that you've been very respectful to be questioning the intelligibility of the
I think you
concept
know the
of
arguments much better than I do. Let me be clear. I think you know much more about this. Like I have moved over to the world of luck. You know way more about the meta ethics of this than I do. So if we're just talking
There's a lot
who
more for me
knows
to
the
learn.
arguments, you're better than I am on that. I am just a simple country ethicist who has these intuitions and tries to make sense of them for people.
I think you're selling yourself short. I've spent a lot of time, I say this to people in like psychology land for many years, and like reintegrating into the philosophy world has been, a bit of a learning curve. Not that much of one. It's not like it's more of a psychological and dispositional adaptation. I'm so used to reading about like, I don't know, study results. But
Mhm.
we're at the 2-hour mark. Are you up for addressing some of the questions in the comments before you go, or do you want to get out of here? Because like,
We
2
could take
hours
a
is more than I asked of you.
we could take a few questions until the family gets home, and then I gotta go.
Okay. Yeah, I was supposed to leave at 5:30, but then it turned out that there's an hour delay. So I got about 15 more minutes. So
Yeah, let's do it.
okay.
Let's do a few.
All right, so let's have a look. I'll field the questions by throwing them up on the screen. We've got a question from Clashman the Third. Which domains of normativity is Aaron a realist about? And then he gives some examples: epistemic, rationality, aesthetic, gastronomic, etc.
Ethics, yes. Epistemic, yes. Rationality, I think soft, yes. Aesthetics, like it's complicated. When I'm feeling really trolly, yes. And gastronomic is a subset of aesthetics, isn't it?
Yeah,
Okay.
like is
like
red wine better than white wine?
like aesthetic realism, I'll take the compromise position about like, you know, there's no true preference about which kind of movie you want to watch. But if you want to watch a movie that has good pacing, this movie is better than that movie for pacing, right? That can be our compromise position. I personally think there are some movies that are just so bad on so many fronts that it's silly to pretend they're good. But at the end of the day, for the most part, heavy caveat, nobody's going to die over those arguments. So I'm not willing to fight over it as much. But I do think that like aesthetic realism has more to it than modernists want to acknowledge sometimes.
Out of just immense personal curiosity, what would be an example of a really terrible movie from all fronts?
From all fronts. I mean, Battlefield Earth is a classic example. I'm just
Okay.
going back through our list of like not a satire movies that we did for sci-fi, for philosophers in space. Like Battlefield Earth is bad on genuinely every front. Now, people can make the argument something is bad enough, it becomes good again. Okay, fine. Now you're enjoying it for a new reason. It's so bad, it's good, Arch. And again, someone can love movies. Like, look, I love bad movies. I love movies that I think are objectively bad. That's why I'm an aesthetic realist. Is I'm like, look, you're right. This movie, like, I like the David Lynch's Dune. Okay, I'm just gonna be honest, and I say I love David Lynch's Dune. I was raised on it. I have a personal association with it. Is it good? Right? Because I don't think that my preferences are the same as whether something is good art.
Okay, fair enough. This one from Mason Colbert is, are these moral properties only restricted to human interactions, or is there something morally wrong about a lion eating a gazelle?
Yeah, I'm weird about this. And this is don't hold other moral realists to this because they're gonna think I'm crazy. But I think moral truths apply basically across the board because I don't believe in free will. So like I don't have a strong bound on moral judgments. So like it's immoral in a sense when a volcano erupts and kills a bunch of people because it causes a bunch of suffering, and it's wrong to cause a bunch of suffering. And all that means, to make sense of that common phrase would be, if the volcano were such an entity that it could do otherwise, it should do otherwise. This applies to sociopaths in my mind. True, genuine, thoroughgoing sociopaths could not do otherwise. They are basically volcanoes. But should they do otherwise? Absolutely. So yeah, I think it applies to. Now, there are trade-offs, right? We're not going to, if we wade into nature and try to make everybody a vegetarian, we're probably going to cause more suffering, not less, because we're going to collapse a bunch of ecosystems. So that's where we go back to the pluralism and the ethical trade-offs. But like, yes, is there, suffering? Now, you can also have conversations about necessary suffering, right? If the lion eats the gazelle because it needs to survive, then that can be justified suffering. We wouldn't necessarily argue that it's immoral. Whereas if, it starts to kill off all the gazelles and threatens the entire population of the ecosystem collapse, then you get into harmful behaviors that are immoral. But does the lion know it's immoral? No, obviously not. Should we try to convince it? No, we shouldn't. But like same thing with aliens. If an alien shows up that's way different than human beings, I think the moral truths still apply to it, whether we can convey them to it or not.
Yeah,
I had that
it's
discussion
interesting
last time.
for people that that saw our moral luck conversation, where we end up basically thinking the same thing on this. Even though you have a realist and I have an anti-realist approach, I have no problem with saying volcanoes are bad, like morally speaking. So yeah, we end up in exactly the same place. And I do find that really interesting. All right.
Hold on. Before we do that one, there's another
Yeah.
related question to that about how if there's no free will,
Yeah.
what does the ought even mean? This is a reference like the ought implies can problem, right? I don't think
Mhm.
ought implies can actually means ought implies could have done otherwise. I think ought implies ought. I think moral responsibility implies could have done otherwise, but I don't believe in moral responsibility. I do believe that we should prevent people from acting immorally, but that's a whole separate conversation from where we are now. We're leading to all the luck stuff that I believe.
Yeah,
So
we did have to cut that luck conversation short, so maybe it's something we should revisit at some point, because I feel like there's a
we could
lot
tie them all
more.
together.
Yeah. It would be really cool to do that. All right. Next question from Blabbit. Do moral realists always take moral facts to be necessary? Why can't there be a possible world where baby torture is okay? What do you make of that one?
Unless like moral facts, so like this is gonna open up a bunch of like moral facts in some ways supervene on non-moral facts, right? They are connected to them in the sense that like if it is wrong to cause unnecessary suffering to babies, then you have to then ask empirically what causes unnecessary suffering to babies, right? Some things that might seem like unnecessary suffering aren't, or whatever, right? Unless the nature of babies is different, right, such that torturing them no longer causes suffering to them, then it couldn't be the case on the moral realist view that baby torture could be okay. You'd have to change some of those morally salient features of baby torture for it to be okay. And what you'd end up doing is being like, well, this is a alien baby that flourishes when it's tortured or something, right? And then you're restating the fundamental moral principles just for a new and weird biology.
Yeah. So I think if you wanted to build on their claim, I don't know if they would endorse this. What if someone just said, no. What I'm asking specifically is like, is it possible for it to be morally obligatory to like torture people for fun? And like to mean that in the full throated sense that you are intentionally inflicting suffering on people.
No, I think it's impossible. I think there is no universe in which non-consensual recreational torture is moral.
Right. Okay, cool. That answers that question. Yeah, because sometimes people throw hypotheticals at realists and they'll say, well, that's not even possible. It's like asking me if 2 + 2 = 5. Okay.
Which is true of
Dog
all
says,
positions, right?
sorry?
Which is true of all positions. All positions are going to be for some hypotheticals. They're going to be like that, and maybe like the sophisticated answer there is that's a begging the question kind of
Mhm.
hypothetical that it assumes an anti-realist framing, the same way you were complaining about the dog torture one earlier.
Okay, Dog's Domain asks, quick question. Can you ask what his views are, presumably you, about deontic versus axiological norms are? What's the source of deontic versus axiological norms? Which is prior? Do they have separate ontology? I'm not even sure what that's asking.
So I think what he's asking there is something like, we have these different moral principles. Some of them are like utilitarianism, where you have to maximize well-being or something like that. Other ones are, you should never lie or you should never deprive people of their autonomy. So I think he's making that's how I've tended to understand deontic here being deontological. I think, and correct us if we're wrong here on reading this, Dog's Domain, please. It's not going to matter totally because I don't have a strong hierarchical view about foundational values. So insofar as there are both deontic and axiological foundational values, there's no easy priority system. There's no way we can math out the hierarchy of values. It's going to be a case by case weighing of the different features, I think.
All right, we got this one. How has he experienced independent moral facts?
Yeah, I mean, this is not going to be a satisfying answer to anyone, right? Like, you like the same way we experience everything, right? Inside my head, in this VR that's being constructed by my brain, I have this very strong experience or feeling of a moral truth, right? Like it impinges upon my brain in a way that like the false claims don't. And when I, see someone being deprived of their autonomy, I feel like I am experiencing vividly the truth of that moral fact. There's no glow, there's no auras, there's nothing like perceptible in a like you could build a machine to measure it kind of way. But again, this is how I experience my own phenomenal consciousness, right? I experience it. I feel like I'm experiencing it. I feel like I'm perceiving it. I feel like I'm discovering the truths by exploring these issues. That's the best that I can say about what I mean by experiencing it.
Cool. All right. I'm looking through the questions and a lot of them, like someone repeated an earlier question. So I'm trying to find something. I know you were looking through them. Did you have any that you spotted that you wanted to address?
Let's
Because
see.
like this one, like if you found out the normative truths happen to be very unexpected and seemingly repugnant, what would you do? Do you take that to just be similar to like what if baby torture is good?
Um, no, we could make it a different question, right? Like this goes back to like the moral foundations height kind of stuff where you have like disgust and care and fairness. I know you are going to be critical about those being universal and things, but like for the subset of humans for whom they apply, um, I don't find repugnance to be morally salient. So purity, repugnance is not a big thing to me. So if something, if it turns out the normative truth is extremely repugnant, it's probably because there's something wrong with my sense of repugnance, not with the normative truth. Right? Like if I'm struggling with transphobia or something, it's not because, the normative truth isn't repugnant to me in that moment subjectively. It's just that I have to recalibrate my sense of what should be repugnant in those cases. And I think a lot of moral progress is probably people recalibrating their sense of what should be repugnant.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising how quickly people can flip on repugnance to things. Like that seems pretty malleable for people to just get over it.
Gay marriage in my lifetime.
Right. Exactly. That's what I'm thinking of. Like, I remember the remarks from what was it? I'm saying I remember, but I remember like was it Clinton in the 90s, like saying, or was it Hillary Clinton saying that she was against gay marriage? And
Right.
then like no one know what at this point, like that was like not that long ago. And now I'm not even sure a Democrat could even run for president and say that and be electable.
Yeah. Though I'm very concerned we're going to see some backsliding on that front after they pretty much rout people on the trans front, which it seems like they're pretty effectively doing. I think people are really underestimating how far Project 2025 is interested in going on those fronts. There's family. One other thing I did catch, Frank Pickles said he's basically saying his moral value judgments are so powerful that they are transcendent. I think that this is a kind of strawbotting that's similar to like the anti-realist strawbotting stuff that we were talking about earlier. Like, I don't think that my moral judgments are necessarily the correct ones. I actually quite the opposite think that I could be wrong about my moral judgments because there are moral truths that I could be misperceiving and don't have full understanding of. And I think a lot of what it is to be, socially conscious or socially aware is to have that critical eye towards your own moral judgments. I just don't think that should result in believing that the moral realism itself is false. I think there are moral truths and we're debating them, right? You and I are debating whether or not all things being equal, one ought not to promote unnecessary suffering, right? Because Conan believes it's cool to promote unnecessary suffering. So there is a disagreement there. And I think it is over something real.
Gotcha. All right. So I think family there, you should probably be wrapping
Yeah, I should roll. But this has been great. Thank you. Thanks everybody for the questions. It's been fun.
Yeah, I got a little thrown off with like things happening around me, so I'm sorry about that. I hope I feel like we could just I could just keep talking about more stuff, but
Sure.
we'll have to do it another time. So thanks so much for being here. I left a link to your podcast in the description. People could go check that out and look up your other stuff. But yeah, I don't want to keep you any longer than I have to. So everybody, like the video, check out Aaron's stuff, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, all that stuff. And now outro video time. So see you all later.